We're here with George Califf from Data Orbital, one of our regular check-ins before Election Day. We're in the thick of early voting. What do we know at this point in the game?
What we know so far at this point, to sum it up, is that turnout so far is extremely high. It's very close to what we'd expect in a presidential year, like 2016. But Republicans are on track to actually perform as they do in midterm years, which is obviously very well. So right now, as of today, Thursday, the Republican ballot advantage is at 11.2%.
So George, where's the blue wave? If you have Republicans up in the 11-point range, what's going on out there?
Yeah, so far there's just not a blue wave. It's not panning out, and it's actually fairly consistent across the state. Even in the bluest of areas like Pima County, Congressional District 3, Congressional District 7, you name it, very consistently Republicans are outperforming what you'd expect to see in a presidential year, which if a blue wave was going to happen, it would have to be presidential year numbers. And so again, we're seeing really high turnout, but the really high turnout has been fairly predominantly on the Republican side, even though Democrats are outpacing themselves by a bit, but Republicans are doing it in much larger margins, particularly Republicans that aren't likely to vote. And that's a key statistic for folks to focus on, that those that have never voted out of the last 4 elections, or only have voted 1 out of the last 4 elections, there's about a 4 or 5% advantage in every single congressional districts for Republicans over Democrats of those ballots that have been requested to be returned.
All right, so let's break this down, because conventional wisdom says that Republicans do better in the midterms and the off-year elections.
That's correct.
You get more voters into the total pool, though, in a presidential. So you've got both a lot more voters in the last midterm election, but you have that Republican spread that you've seen before.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's performing abnormally, and it's causing places, let's say, for example, like District 18, where the Republican ballot advantage on the same day in 2014 was 10%. This year it's 5%. But because turnout is literally double, 16,000 ballots in 14 on this day, 32,000 ballots for Thursday, and now we're looking at a Republican net advantage of 1,700 ballots in 2018 versus 1,600 in 2014. So even with the disparity and the performance not where it was in 14, but because of the high turnout, Republicans still have a very strong advantage.
And now that you've had a chance to reflect on these numbers, you and your firm, you've gone back and readjusted some of your picks in terms of whether a district leans Republican, is safe Republican, leans Dem, safe Dem. What have you come away with there?
Yeah, so we actually did about 8 rating changes earlier this week, and all of them in the Republican favor. Particularly, let's focus on the state Senate. We now rate LD 18 from a leans Democrat to a toss-up. There's a chance that Republicans could potentially pick up that seat in Frank Schmuck on the Republican side against Sean Bowie on the Democratic side. We now are rating LD 17 as a leans Republican. LD 8 went from leans to likely Republican in Frank Pratt running in that rural district. And then we also made a rating change in Legislative District 21, where Senator Rick Gray, the Republican's running against independent Kathy Connect. We took that from a toss-up to a leans Republican. So good news all across the board for Republicans on the Senate side and then also on the House side as well.
The Democrats were banking on this year as the year where they either take control of the Senate, maybe get a tie in the Senate. Democrats will say, well, we have new voters. They don't typically vote by mail. They're going to go to the polls. What do you think about that claim?
I mean, look, that is, at this point, that's the last possible play that a Democratic strategist would have, right? The last sort of trick out of the hat would be, okay, you're going to have a lot of voters show up on Election Day. I suppose it could happen. That's not normal. That hasn't tracked in any presidential or midterm year up until this point. So I think it's fairly unlikely. And that's why, I'm pretty bullish at this point that Republicans hold the state Senate, and it could be with the exact same margin that they have today, which is a 17-13 split, which again, you'd asked me 3 months ago, and I've actually said it even, I'm sure, on the show, that I did not think that was going to be the case. I think that's more likely than not to be the case at this point.
All right, well, let's talk about that optimism versus pessimism. You are one of the state's most pessimistic pollsters, at least on the Republican side. You came out with a poll recently in the U.S. Senate race. Talk about that, and also talk about it. Are you revisiting that in light of some of these numbers that you've seen?
Yes, so we did have a poll last week that showed that Congresswoman Sinema was up by 4%. It was more pessimistic than a handful of other public polling that's been put out. And that was assuming a closer to Democratic surge scenario model, right? So I think now obviously we're going to have to revisit it in light with the numbers that we're seeing so far. We expect about 35% of the vote to be in. So I think we're now comfortable as data folks to say, okay, we need to start adjusting our models. And I think, again, from sort of the conversations that have been had, Congresswoman McSally's chances as a Republican have never been better to take that seat. I think a lot of handicappers across the country and in the state had put it in a pure toss-up column. I think it maybe is still there, but I think it may be leaning a little bit more to the right because of some of the turnout numbers. I think the big question will be two major demographics and to watch for what happens with them. Who wins independence, right? And so there's discussion back and forth about, all right, is Sinema up, McSally up, what do independents look like? And is there enough Governor Ducey voting Republicans that choose to vote Democrat in the U.S. Senate? Obviously, that is not a very common thing for someone to vote for a Republican for one statewide race and a Democrat for the other. Those are the two people to watch. But I agree. I think the race is going in the direction that someone like McSally would want to see at this point, especially with the turnout numbers the way that they are.
So looking at those turnout numbers, if you are in the Sinema campaign, you really need some ticket splitters out there, like you said, which
Yes.
is not impossible, but it's not the world's most normal thing to happen in a cycle.
Absolutely.
Like this.
I was actually telling someone this morning, the path to victory has to be with the numbers the way they are today. She has to outperform where Clinton performed versus Trump in the suburban affluent areas. So in Legislative District 28 in the Central Corridor in Paradise Valley, District 18 in Ahwatukee and Chandler, District 17 in Chandler, at this point Sinema has to do better than Clinton did because Clinton beat Trump in most of those places in the 2016 presidential. Not only does she have to do that well, she has to even outperform where Clinton was. And again, that's not an easy thing to do in districts where Governor Ducey right now is more likely than not going to win against David Garcia by 15-20%. So she literally has to do the inverse.
I'm curious if you've looked at this. 4 years ago, David Garcia was a candidate for statewide office once again, that time for superintendent of public instruction, yes. This time for governor. But back then, he won Maricopa County, which is typically a GOP stronghold. Yeah. If you would have told most people in the political world that a Democrat was going to win Maricopa County, then you would have said that individual was going to win the whole thing. Yeah. Didn't happen. His opponent, Diane Douglas, cleaned up in rural Arizona. Where do you think we sit now in the rural versus urban breakdown in Arizona, how that's going to affect some of these statewide races? Yeah,
an interesting caveat to what you said as well, too. Not just in rural Arizona, she actually outperformed, I think still slightly lost, but outperformed in Pima County.
Right.
Which was, again, no one would have guessed that going into it. Right now, rural Arizona is, the turnout is still fairly strong. But as, as we noted in the previous episode, that only about 50 or so less, even maybe 45 or 50% of the vote comes in early total in rural Arizona. There's a lot of people that vote day of. So Navajo County, for example, only has a small fraction of their vote in thus far, which is skewing some of the numbers in, let's say, something like District 6. So I think rural Arizona is still coming in strong. Republicans are doing well. And actually right now, Republicans are washing out the Democratic advantage in Pima County, nearly 1-to-1 with rural Arizona, and it's allowing Maricopa to dominate the statewide numbers, which has been very interesting, and again has allowed that sort of strong performance to play out so far in early voting, and we expect it to continue through the rest of early voting.
George Califf, great insight as always. Thanks.
Thank you.